They called her a prehistoric relic to her face. Dr. Marcus Thorne, the hospital's arrogant chief resident, actually placed a $500 bet that the middle-aged nurse with the limp and the battered sneakers wouldn't last a single shift at Chicago Memorial. She was too slow. She checked pulses by hand instead of trusting the monitors. She didn't fit his image of elite medicine. But the mockery died the instant the storm doors crashed open and a critically wounded Delta Force commander was wheeled in. Because the dying soldier didn't look at the Ivy League surgeon. He locked eyes with the invisible old nurse, fought through the agony, and raised a bloodied hand to salute her. What happened next didn't just silence the room, it brought the entire hospital to its knees. The rain over Chicago wasn't just falling, it was hammering against the city like a judgment. It slicked the asphalt of the Magnificent Mile into a black mirror and turned the windows of the Chicago Memorial Hospital into blurring sheets of gray. Inside the emergency room, the weather felt distant, separated by double-pane glass and the relentless, sterile hum of the air filtration system. But the chill had a way of seeping in, settling into the bones of anyone who had been standing for too long. Evelyn Wright felt that chill specifically in her right knee. At 56 years old, she moved with a deceptive slowness, a measured cadence that younger staff mistook for fatigue. She was a woman of average height, her frame sturdy but hidden beneath scrubs that were a size too large. Her hair, a steel gray that she refused to dye, was pulled back into a severe, practical bun that had started to fray at the edges after 10 hours on shift. On her feet, she didn't wear the sleek, rubberized clogs that the other nurses favored. Instead, she wore a pair of battered New Balance sneakers, scuffed and worn down at the heels, the laces double knotted. She stood by bed 4, her fingers pressed gently against the radial artery of an elderly man sleeping off a reaction to medication. She wasn't looking at the expensive GE monitor glowing above his head. She was looking at the rise and fall of his chest, feeling the thrum of life under her fingertips. 1, 2, 3, strong, regular. You know the machine does that for you, right? The voice was smooth, baritone, and laced with a condescension that could curdle milk. Evelyn didn't flinch. She finished her count, noted it on the paper chart clipped to the bed rail, and then turned. Dr. Marcus Thorne stood at the nursing station, looking less like a trauma surgeon and more like a man who had gotten lost on his way to a GQ photo shoot. He was 34, tall, with jawline-hugging stubble that was surely trimmed with laser precision. His white coat was starch-stiff, and in his hand, he held a tablet like a shield. He was the chief resident, a man who worshipped data and treated intuition like a superstition. "The monitor has a 3-second delay, doctor," Evelyn said, her voice raspy. It was a voice that sounded like it had been used to shouting over engines, though here she kept it low. "And the pleth wave is erratic because the lead is loose. His pulse is 62. Strong." Thorne smirked, tapping his tablet with a stylus. "And yet, the digital record hasn't updated in 10 minutes because you're writing on paper. We are a level 1 trauma center, Evelyn, not a Civil War field hospital. Upload the vitals, now." He turned his back on her, leaning over the counter to whisper something to Brittany, a young nurse with bright pink scrubs and eyes that were constantly glued to her phone. Brittany was 22, fresh out of school, and terrified of making mistakes, which made her eager to please Thorne. Evelyn walked toward the station to file the chart. She didn't mean to eavesdrop, but years of training had tuned her ears to pick up low frequencies, the sound of a distant mortar, or a whisper in a quiet room. 500, Thorne murmured to Brittany, tilting his head back toward Evelyn. 500 says the prehistoric relic doesn't make it to sunrise. She walks like she's underwater. It's embarrassing. Brittany giggled nervously, glancing at Evelyn. "That's mean, Dr. Thorne. She's just thorough." "She's a liability," Thorne corrected, his voice hardening. "Efficiency saves lives. She's slowing down the flow." Evelyn gripped the paper chart until her knuckles turned white. The insult stung, not because it was true, but because she couldn't defend herself. She couldn't tell him about the speed she used to possess, or why she moved deliberately now. She just placed the chart in the bin and turned away, her face a mask of calm. Suddenly, the triage doors burst open. "We need a bed! Respiratory distress female, 8 years old," a paramedic shouted, wheeling a gurney in at a run. The energy in the room shifted instantly. The lethargy of the night shift evaporated. "Bay 2!" Thorne commanded, snapping into action. He strode toward the gurney, his tablet already raised to scan the incoming digital ID. "Get her hooked up. I need O2 sats, heart rate, and respiratory rate on the screen immediately." Evelyn was already moving. She didn't run. Running caused panic, but she covered the ground with long, efficient strides that put her at the bedside before the gurney even locked into place. On the bed lay Lily, a terrified 8-year-old girl with wild curly hair and a frozen t-shirt. Her lips were tinting blue. She was sitting bolt upright, her small hands gripping the rails so hard her fingers looked like wax. She was gasping, her chest heaving, but no air seemed to be getting in. The high-pitched wheeze was audible even without a stethoscope. "Mama!" Lily choked out, her eyes wide with terror. "I'm here, baby. I'm here." Her mother, a frazzled woman in a raincoat, sobbed from the doorway, held back by a security guard. Thorne loomed over the child. "Nurse, get the leads on. The pulse ox isn't reading." He barked at Brittany, who was fumbling with the sticky pads, her hands shaking. I can't get a signal. Her hands are too cold," Brittany stammered. Thorne looked at the blank monitor, frustration etched on his face. "I need data. Is she compensating? What's her saturation? I can't treat what I can't measure." He jammed his stethoscope into his ears, but the girl was thrashing, making it impossible to listen to her lungs clearly. "Hold her down! Someone give me a reading." The chaos was escalating. The child's panic was feeding the asthma, tightening her airways further. Thorne's shouting was only making it worse. Lily looked at the doctor's angry face, at the wires, and she started to hyperventilate, her eyes rolling back. Evelyn stepped into the space between the doctor and the child. She didn't look at the monitor. She didn't look at Thorne. "Hey," Evelyn said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a peculiar, grounding resonance. It cut through the noise. She reached out and placed one warm, calloused hand flat against the center of Lily's chest, and the other gently on the girl's shoulder. "Lily, look at me," Evelyn commanded softly. The girl's eyes darted frantically, then locked onto Evelyn's face. Evelyn's expression was an anchor, calm, unshakable, and kind. "You're okay," Evelyn said, maintaining eye contact. "The air is right here. We just need to find it." "Can't," Lily wheezed, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, you can," Evelyn said. She didn't check a screen. She felt the rapid, fluttery beat of the heart under her palm. She felt the trapped air vibrating in the ribcage. "Lily, imagine there's a birthday cake right here." Evelyn held up her index finger like a candle. "I need you to blow out the candle, hard, pursed lips. Do it with me." Evelyn took a breath and exaggerated the exhale, blowing out through tight lips. Whoosh. "Blow it out, Lily," Evelyn urged. "Blow the fire out." Lily stared at her, the panic momentarily suspended by the strange request. She tried. A short, ragged puff. Good. Again. Longer this time. "Big cake," Evelyn encouraged, her eyes never leaving the girl's. "Blow." Lily squeezed her eyes shut and forced air out through pursed lips. The back pressure forced her airways open just a fraction. "That's it," Evelyn soothed, her hand feeling the chest wall relax slightly. Again, 1, 2, 3, blow. Within 30 seconds, the frantic gasping slowed. The blue tint around Lily's lips began to fade into pink. Brittany finally managed to secure the pulse oximeter clip. Beep, beep, beep. The monitor sprang to life. 88%, then 90%, then 92%. Thorne stood frozen for a moment, his stethoscope hovering over the girl's chest. He looked at the monitor, then at Evelyn, who was still holding the girl's hand, whispering praise. "Albuterol nebulizer, 2.5 milligrams, Thorne ordered, his voice tight. He didn't look at Evelyn, he looked at the screen. "Get it started, now that we finally have a reading." Evelyn stepped back to let the respiratory therapist in. She smoothed her scrubs, her heart rate slowly coming down from the adrenaline spike she hadn't shown on the outside. As the crisis settled and Lily began to breathe the medicated mist, Thorne marched over to Evelyn. He cornered her near the supply closet, away from the patient's family. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed. Evelyn looked up at him, blinking. "She was panicking, doctor. Panic constricts the bronchioles. I was helping her breathe. You were obstructing a physician, Thorne spat. I asked for vitals. I asked for data. You decided to play grandmother and waste time with breathing games while her oxygen levels were critical. You delayed the nebulizer. The nebulizer wouldn't have worked if she was hyperventilating, Evelyn said, keeping her voice level. She needed to calm down to accept the medication. I determine what she needs. Thorne's voice rose, turning heads in the waiting room. I am the attending. You are a nurse. Your job is to facilitate my orders, not improvise. You are an antique, right? You don't fit in this system. You're too slow, you're too emotional, and you rely on feelings instead of facts. He leaned in closer. The smell of expensive cologne was overpowering. This is your last warning. You check the boxes, you use the tablet, you follow the protocol. If you pull a stunt like that again, undermining my authority in a trauma bay, I will have you escorted out by security before your shift ends. Do you understand me? Evelyn stared at his tie. It was silk, blue with tiny sailboats. She thought about the letter sitting on her kitchen table, the notification from the insurance company about Arthur's chemotherapy coverage. It was tied to her employment. If she lost this job, Arthur lost his treatment. If Arthur lost his treatment, she lost Arthur. The fire that wanted to roar up her throat, the soldier that wanted to break Thorne's finger for pointing it in her face. She shoved them both deep down into the dark pit of her stomach. She swallowed the pride that had once earned her medals in a desert half a world away. I understand, Dr. Thorne, Evelyn whispered, lowering her eyes. It won't happen again. See that it doesn't, Thorne sneered. He turned on his heel, pulling out his phone as he walked away. She heard him laugh a moment later, undoubtedly collecting on the first part of his bet with the other residents. Evelyn stood alone in the hallway. Her knee throbbed in time with the rain battering the glass. She looked at her trembling hands, not from fear, but from rage, and shoved them into her pockets. She was invisible. She was a ghost in the machine. And for Arthur's sake, she had to stay that way. The heavy steel door of the stairwell clicked shut, severing the connection between the sterile, fluorescent humming of the emergency room and the damp, concrete silence of the fire escape. For Evelyn Wright, that click was the most beautiful sound she had heard in 6 hours. She didn't stop at the landing. She climbed down half a flight of stairs to the corner where the shadows were deepest, a spot where the security cameras were blind and the heating vents from the building vented warm, stale air. It was her foxhole. Evelyn groaned as she sat down on the cold metal step, her back pressing instinctively against the rough concrete wall. Her eyes immediately snapped to the door above, then to the door below. Clear, secure. She let out a breath she felt she had been holding since she clocked in. Reaching into the deep pocket of her oversized scrub top, she pulled out a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. It was turkey and cheese on white bread, dry and flattened from hours of being crushed against her side. It wasn't appetizing, but fuel wasn't about enjoyment. It was about maintenance. But before she took a bite, her hand went to her right knee. The rain outside was relentless, a drumming percussion against the building's exterior that vibrated through the metal stairs. Every drop seemed to tighten the invisible screws inside her joint. Evelyn rolled up her pant leg just enough to expose the skin. It wasn't pretty. A jagged starburst scar, shiny and pale against her skin, mapped the chaotic trajectory of a mortar round that had landed too close in a dusty village outside Kandahar 15 years ago. The surgeons had put the bone back together with pins and titanium, but they couldn't fix the nerves that screamed every time the barometric pressure dropped. She rubbed the scar with her thumb, a rhythmic circular motion. The pain was sharp, a hot wire running down her shin, but it was familiar. It was a reminder. In the ER, she was Nurse Wright, the slow, middle-aged woman who annoyed the residents. Here, touching the twisted flesh, she was Dusty, the medic who had refused to board the medevac chopper until her entire squad was accounted for. Still hurts when it rains, huh? Evelyn's head snapped up. Her hand didn't move for a weapon. She didn't carry one anymore, but her muscles coiled, ready to spring. Standing on the landing above her was Gus. Gus was a fixture of Chicago Memorial, a janitor who seemed as old as the building itself. He was a wiry African-American man in his late 60s, his gray custodial jumpsuit always pressed with military precision. He moved with a slight limp of his own, dragging a mop bucket with wheels that squeaked rhythmically. His face was a map of deep creases, and his eyes were clouded but sharp, like old flint. Evelyn relaxed her shoulders, though she didn't smile. "Just a bit of arthritis, Gus. You know how it is." Gus didn't move to clean. He just stood there, leaning on his mop handle, looking down at her. He looked at the sandwich in her lap. He looked at the way she was sitting, tucked into the corner, knees drawn up, back protected by the wall, eyes scanning the entry points. It wasn't how a tired nurse sat. It was how a soldier sat on patrol. "Arthritis," Gus repeated. His voice was gravelly, deep and resonant. "My arthritis acts up in the damp, too. Got mine in '68. Hugh City." The silence that stretched between them wasn't awkward. It was heavy with understanding. Gus didn't ask about her service. He didn't ask why a woman with a 1,000-yard stare was changing bedpans for a living. He just looked at the scar on her knee, then back at her eyes. He recognized the ghosts because they haunted him, too. "You eat that dry bread, you're gonna choke," Gus grunted. He reached into the large pocket of his jumpsuit and pulled out a small carton of chocolate milk, the kind they served in the pediatrics ward. He walked down the few steps, moving slowly, and placed the carton on the step next to her foot. "Hydrate," he said simply. "You don't have to," Evelyn started. "Check your 6, soldier," Gus muttered, turning his back to her to head back up the stairs. "Storm's getting worse out there. Bad night for flying." Evelyn watched him go, the squeak of his mop bucket fading as the heavy door closed again. She picked up the milk. It was cold against her fingers. "Check your 6. A warning, or maybe just an acknowledgement. I see you. You're one of us." She pierced the carton with the straw and took a sip, the sugar hitting her bloodstream. She closed her eyes, trying to find 10 minutes of peace. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound wasn't in the stairwell. It was outside, muffled by the storm and the thick walls, but unmistakable. The rhythmic beating of rotors cutting through heavy air. Evelyn froze. The sandwich dropped from her hand. For a second, she wasn't in Chicago. The smell of wet concrete was replaced by the smell of burning diesel and copper blood. The rain became a sandstorm. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Not here, not now. She forced herself to breathe, box breathing. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. Then the world shattered. "Attention all personnel. Code triage, Mascal, Level 1, trauma, Mascal." The voice on the overhead PA system wasn't the usual robotic calmness. It was urgent. Mascal, mass casualty. Evelyn was on her feet before the announcement finished. The pain in her knee vanished, replaced by a surge of adrenaline that flooded her system like high-octane fuel. She didn't walk up the stairs. She took them 2 at a time. She burst through the door back into the ER. The atmosphere had transformed. The lethargy was gone, replaced by a frantic, organized chaos. Nurses were sprinting to the trauma bays, ripping open sterile packs. Residents were shouting for blood types. "What do we have?" Evelyn asked, grabbing a pair of gloves from a wall dispenser as she fell in step with Brittany. Brittany looked pale, her hands shaking as she tried to tie her isolation gown. "Incoming from O'Hare. Military transport. They said it was an ambush. Special ops." Evelyn's stomach dropped. Delta. It had to be. "How many?" Evelyn asked, her voice turning into the steel command tone she usually suppressed. 3 critical. 1 in cardiac arrest en route. 2 minutes out." Evelyn scanned the room. Trauma Bay 1 was the largest, equipped for the worst cases. That was where the unit commander would go. She moved toward it, her mind already cataloging the tray setup. Chest tubes, central lines, rapid infusers. "Right!" The bark cut through the noise. Dr. Marcus Thorne stood in the center of the bay, pulling on a trauma gown. His face was flushed with a mix of excitement and anxiety. This was his moment, a high-profile military trauma that would make the evening news. He needed everything to be perfect. He needed to look like a god. He saw Evelyn approaching the airway cart. "Get away from there," Thorne shouted, pointing a gloved finger at the door. Evelyn stopped. "Doctor, you're going to need a second line for the rapid infuser. I said move!" Thorne stepped in front of her, physically blocking her path to the patient zone. "This is a Delta Force extraction team. These are elite soldiers. I need my best surgical residents on this, not a geriatric nurse with shaky hands who believes in breathing exercises." "My hands don't shake when it matters," Evelyn said, her voice low and dangerous. "I don't care!" Thorne snapped, adjusting his protective goggles. "Look at you. You're limping. You're tired. You are a liability. I have Dr. Silva and Dr. Chang coming down. I don't want you tripping over the ventilator cords." The ambulance bay doors rumbled, the sound of sirens and heavy engines growing louder. The flashing red lights bounced off the wet pavement outside, painting the ER walls in strokes of blood. "Then where do you want me?" Evelyn asked, her jaw tight. Thorne looked around, his eyes frantic. He pointed toward the supply closet at the far end of the hall, near the vending machines. "Inventory," Thorne said dismissively. "Go to the supply room, count the damn saline bags. Make sure we have enough gauze. Just stay out of the bay. Stay out of the way of the professionals." "Doctor, that is an order, nurse, right?" Thorne screamed, his voice cracking slightly. "If you are in this trauma bay when those doors open, you are fired. Do you hear me? Fired. No pension, no insurance. Gone." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "Arthur?" Evelyn looked at the empty trauma bed, waiting for a soldier who was bleeding out right now. She looked at the expensive equipment that Thorne treated like toys. She knew, with a certainty that burned in her gut, that this room was about to become a slaughterhouse if controlled by ego rather than skill. But she saw Arthur's face. She saw the chemotherapy bills. "Understood, doctor," Evelyn said. The words tasted like ash. She backed away. She retreated. Thorne didn't watch her go. He was already yelling at Brittany to adjust the overhead lights. Evelyn walked down the hallway, past the scurrying residents, past the terrified patients in the waiting area. She walked to the supply closet and opened the door. It was a small, windowless room filled with floor-to-ceiling metal shelves. It smelled of cardboard and antiseptic. Evelyn stepped inside and let the door click shut, leaving it cracked just an inch. She stood in the dark, her hands trembling now, not from fear, but from the immense effort it took not to scream. She was a combat medic. Her place was in the blood and the mud, keeping men alive when the world was ending. And now she was counting boxes of gauze while a hero died 20 feet away. Then the external doors crashed open. The wind roared into the hospital, carrying the scent of ozone and exhaust. "Move! Move! Clear the lane!" The shouting wasn't from doctors. It was deep, guttural, the voices of men who ate adrenaline for breakfast. Through the crack in the door, Evelyn watched. A phalanx of soldiers in wet, dark camouflage gear stormed in, flanking a stretcher. They weren't hospital security. They were giants, their faces obscured by mud and grease paint, weapons slung tight against their chests. And in the center of the storm, on the gurney, lay a man who looked less like a patient and more like a fallen gladiator. Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes narrowing in the dim light of the closet. She couldn't see his face yet, but she saw the blood. There was so much blood. "Inventory," she whispered to herself, a bitter tear tracing a hot path down her cheek. "Just count the damn bags." But she didn't turn to the shelves. She kept her eyes on the gap in the door, and she waited. The double doors of the emergency room didn't just open, they were breached. The storm outside had been a dull roar, but now it screamed into the sterile hallway, bringing with it a gust of freezing wind, the smell of ozone, and the metallic tang of wet asphalt. But those scents were instantly overpowered by something else, the sharp, unmistakable reek of cordite and fresh, iron-heavy blood. Dr. Marcus Thorne had been expecting paramedics. He had been expecting a chaotic but manageable handoff from the local EMTs. He was not expecting an invasion. 6 men moved through the doors in a tight fluid wedge formation. They were dressed in black tactical gear soaked through to the skin, water dripping from their Kevlar vests and combat boots. They moved with a terrifying, predatory grace, their eyes scanning the room behind ballistic glasses. They carried weapons, carbines slung tight against their chests, that looked alien and threatening under the harsh hospital lights. In the center of this moving fortress was a gurney. "Clear the lane! Clear the damn lane!" The voice belonged to Sergeant Major Knox Miller. He was a mountain of a man, easily 6'4", with a beard that held droplets of rain and mud. His face was a mask of controlled fury, and his gloved hands gripped the rails of the gurney so hard the metal groaned. He wasn't asking for permission, he was demanding space. The hospital staff froze. Brittany, the young nurse, dropped a roll of medical tape. Even the security guard by the entrance took an instinctive step back, his hand hovering uselessly over his radio. "Trauma 1!" Thorne shouted, his voice cracking slightly before he found his command register. "Get him to Trauma 1, now!" The soldiers didn't wait for directions. They seemed to know the layout instinctively. They surged past the nursing station, the wheels of the gurney screeching on the linoleum. Lying on that gurney was Colonel Samuel Iron Vance. Even in his ruined state, Vance was imposing. He was a man built of dense muscle and scars, his skin tanned from years under a desert sun, now rapidly paling to the color of ash. His tactical vest had been cut away in the field, revealing a torso that was a landscape of violence. But it was his abdomen that drew every eye in the room. It was a nightmare-made flesh. A jagged tear ran across his midsection, a horrific exit wound from a high-velocity round or shrapnel. Loops of intestine had spilled out, glistening and wet under the trauma lights, resting against his hip. Blood soaked everything, the sheets, the rails, the floor, leaving a thick red trail behind them as they ran. Inside the supply closet, Evelyn Wright stood in the dark. She held a box of saline bags in her hands, her thumbs pressing into the cardboard until it dented. 1, 2, 3. She tried to count. She tried to follow orders. Keep your head down. Keep the insurance. Do it for Arthur. But the sounds were leaking through the crack in the door. She heard the specific wet gurgle of a suction machine struggling to clear an airway. She heard the frantic, high-pitched ping, ping, ping of a cardiac monitor that wasn't finding a rhythm. And she heard the fear in the voices outside. Not just the fear of the nurses, but the fear of the doctors. Inventory, she told herself. Just do the inventory. Then she heard Thorne's voice, high and thin. "Oh God, look at that! Get the abdominal pads. Get me everything we have. He's eviscerated." Evelyn dropped the box. The sound of the saline bags hitting the floor was swallowed by the chaos outside. Her body moved before her brain gave permission. It was a muscle memory honed in the back of Black Hawks and in dusty tents while mortars walked toward her position. When the shouting started, you didn't hide. You moved toward the fire. She pushed the door open, just enough to slip her body through. She didn't march into the center of the room. She moved like a shadow, hugging the wall, sliding behind the crash cart near the corner of Trauma Bay 1. The scene was a riot of noise and motion. Thorne was leaning over the colonel's abdomen, his eyes wide, fixated on the gruesome sight of the exposed intestines. "We need to pack this. He's losing volume. Get the O-negative hanging. Pour it in." "BP is 70/40 and dropping," shouted Dr. Silva, a second-year resident who looked like he might vomit. He was fumbling with an IV line, his hands slick with rain and blood transferred from the soldier's gear. "He's in hemorrhagic shock," Thorne yelled, grabbing handfuls of sterile gauze and shoving them toward the abdominal wound. "We need to get him to the OR immediately to control this bleeding. Call surgery. Tell them we're coming up for an explorative laparotomy." Sergeant Major Knox was hovering over Thorne's shoulder, a looming threat. "You fix him, Doc! You don't let him die on this table!" "I'm trying!" Thorne snapped back, sweat beading on his forehead. "Look at this damage! He's gutted!" Evelyn stood in the shadows, her eyes narrowing. She watched the way Thorne worked. He was tunneling. He was suffering from target fixation. He saw the blood, he saw the gore, and his brain had stopped right there. Big hole, big blood, fix hole. It was the most dangerous trap in trauma medicine. She shifted her gaze to the patient. She ignored the intestines. They looked horrific, yes. But as she watched the blood pooling around the wound, she noticed something Thorne had missed in his panic. The blood was dark. Maroon. It was oozing, not spurting. That was venous bleeding. It was messy. It was terrifying to look at. But it wasn't spraying the ceiling. It wasn't killing him, right this second. "Look at the patient, not the wound," Evelyn's old training officer whispered in her memory. She looked at Colonel Vance's face. It was gray, waxy. His lips were blue. She looked at the monitor. Heart rate, 140, tachycardia. Blood pressure, 70/40, narrowing pulse pressure. Why? If he was bleeding out from the belly, his heart would be racing to pump what was left, but the pressure would be widening before the crash. This was different. The numbers didn't match the picture Thorne was painting. Evelyn took a half step out of the shadows. She needed to see his neck. The collar of Vance's tactical shirt had been ripped open. Under the harsh halogen lights, Evelyn saw it. The jugular vein on the right side of his neck wasn't flat. It wasn't collapsed, which is what happens when a patient bleeds out. It was distended. It stood out like a thick blue cord against his neck, pulsing angrily, straining against the skin. JVD, Evelyn thought, her breath catching in her throat. Jugular venous distension. His heart wasn't empty. His heart was full. It was trying to pump, but the blood had nowhere to go. Her eyes dropped to his chest. Thorne and the residents were ignoring it, focused entirely on the abdomen. Vance's chest was covered in mud and smears of blood, but there was no massive open wound there, just a small, dark puncture mark on the left side, near the sternum. It looked like nothing, a shrapnel nick, a minor scratch. But the left side of his chest wasn't moving. While his right side heaved with a desperate effort to pull in air, the left side was a statue, silent, still. Evelyn's mind raced, connecting the dots that Thorne was too panicked to see. Distended neck veins, muffled or absent breath sounds, hypotension, Beck's triad. "Intubate!" Thorne screamed, grabbing the laryngoscope. "He's not breathing effectively. We need to secure the airway and push the sedatives. Give him 100 of succinylcholine and 20 of etomidate." Evelyn's blood ran cold. If Thorne pushed those drugs, paralytics and sedatives, they would relax the vascular tone. The colonel's blood pressure, already critically low, would bottom out instantly. And if Thorne tried to force air into that chest with a ventilator without fixing the pressure first, "You'll kill him," Evelyn whispered. She looked at the clock on the wall. She looked at the door to the supply closet, safety, her paycheck, Arthur's chemotherapy. Then she looked at Colonel Vance. He was fighting. Even unconscious, his body was fighting. He was drowning in his own blood, trapped inside his own skin. Thorne tilted the colonel's head back, opening the mouth. "Push the meds," he ordered Silva. "Pushing," Silva said, his thumb hovering over the plunger of the syringe. The invisible tether that held Evelyn to her quiet, safe life snapped. The nurse vanished. The ghost medic stepped forward. "Stop!" The word didn't come out as a plea. It came out as a command, sharp and percussive as a gunshot. Evelyn stepped fully into the light. She didn't look like a grandmother anymore. She didn't look like an employee. She moved with the aggressive kinetic energy of a soldier taking point. "Don't you dare push those drugs!" The room went silent for a microsecond. Thorne froze, the laryngoscope halfway into Vance's mouth. He looked up, his eyes wild, taking a second to register who had spoken. "You?" Thorne's face twisted into a mask of incredulous rage. "I told you to get out. Security. Get this woman out of here." "He's not bleeding out from the belly," Evelyn shouted, ignoring the security guard who started to move toward her. She pointed a shaking finger at the colonel's neck. "Look at his jugular. It's distended. Look at his chest. No movement on the left." "He's eviscerated, you stupid woman," Thorne roared, spitting saliva. "His guts are on the table. He is in hypovolemic shock." "It's venous bleeding," Evelyn yelled back, closing the distance. She was beside the bed now, standing toe-to-toe with the chaos. "The bowel wound looks bad, but it's not the killer. He has a tension pneumothorax and cardiac tamponade. His heart is being crushed. If you sedate him, you kill him." Sergeant Major Knox looked from the screaming doctor to the small, gray-haired woman who was standing her ground like a tank trap. His eyes narrowed. "Security!" Thorne screamed again. "Remove her! She is assaulting a patient!" Two guards grabbed Evelyn's arms. They were big men, used to dealing with drunks and junkies. "Get off me!" Evelyn struggled, but they dragged her back a step. "Push the drugs, Silva!" Thorne commanded, turning back to the patient. "Ignore her!" "No!" Evelyn's scream tore physically at her throat. She saw Silva's thumb depress the plunger. She saw the fluid entering the IV. She saw the monitor numbers begin to plummet. 70, 40, 60, 30. The colonel's heart was fluttering, a bird trapped in a crushing fist. He had seconds. Evelyn didn't think about Arthur. She didn't think about the rent. She thought about the oath she had taken. Not the nursing one, but the one she made in the dirt of a foreign land. I will not leave a fallen comrade. She stopped fighting the guard's grip to pull away. Instead, she dropped her center of gravity, twisted her hips, and drove her elbow backward into the solar plexus of the guard on her right. He doubled over, gasping. It wasn't nursing. It was close-quarters combat. The sound of the security guard gasping for air was the only thing audible beneath the screaming alarms. Evelyn had driven her elbow back with the precision of a piston, collapsing the man's diaphragm. It wasn't a move taught in nursing school. It was a reflex carved into her muscle memory from nights spent in places that didn't exist on any map. The second guard, a heavy-set man named Miller, who usually spent his shifts napping in the booth, stared at his partner on the floor. He blinked, his brain struggling to reconcile the image of the limping, gray-haired woman with the blur of violence that had just occurred. "Grab her!" Thorne shrieked, his voice climbing an octave. "She's psychotic! Restrain her!" Miller lunged. He was big, relying on mass rather than technique. He reached out with meaty hands to grab Evelyn's scrub top. Evelyn didn't back away. She stepped in. She pivoted on her good leg, ignoring the screaming protest of her scarred right knee. As Miller's hand closed on her shoulder, she trapped his wrist with her left hand, clamping it to her chest. With her right hand, she struck the nerve cluster in his radial forearm, hard. Miller howled and his grip went slack. In one fluid motion, Evelyn swept his leg, using his own forward momentum against him. He hit the linoleum with a bone-rattling thud that shook the crash carts. The room went deathly still. Brittany, the young nurse, pressed her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide as saucers. She had watched Evelyn struggle to open pickle jars in the break room. She had watched Evelyn take 5 minutes to climb a flight of stairs. Now, she was watching a predator move through the room. "Dr. Silva!" Thorne yelled, panic turning his face a blotchy red. "Push the drugs! Do it now before she kills us all!" Dr. Silva's hand trembled over the IV port. The syringe was locked in. The paralytic was ready to flow. "Don't do it, kid!" Evelyn growled. She was moving toward the bed now, a low, stalking advance. "You push that plunger, you stop his heart. You become a murderer. Is that what you want on your conscience?" Silva hesitated, looking between the terrifying woman and his attending physician. "I am your chief resident," Thorne bellowed, abandoning the patient's head to intercept Evelyn. "I am ordering you to—" Thorne made the mistake of stepping into her path. He was tall, fit from gym sessions, and completely unprepared for real-world violence. He threw his hands up to shove her back. Evelyn didn't break stride. She dropped her shoulder, bracing her core, and drove her body into his sternum. It was a check that would have made a linebacker proud. Thorne went airborne. He crashed backward into a stainless steel instrument tray. Metal clattered loudly against the tile floor, forceps, scissors, and scalpels scattering like shrapnel. Thorne scrambled on the slick floor, gasping, his pristine white coat smeared with the blood that had pooled there. "You're finished!" Thorne screamed from the floor, clutching his chest. "You are finished, right?" Evelyn ignored him. She was at the bedside. She looked down at Colonel Vance. Up close, he looked even worse. His skin was the color of wet ash. The veins in his neck were roped and throbbing, desperate to offload blood into a heart that couldn't accept it. The pressure inside the pericardial sac, the tough membrane surrounding the heart, was squeezing the life out of him. She scanned the tray that hadn't been knocked over. "Needle," she whispered, her eyes locked onto a 14-gauge angiocath. It was a thick, orange-hubbed needle, usually used for rapid fluid resuscitation. It was long enough. It had to be. She ripped the sterile packaging open with her teeth, spitting the paper onto the floor. "What is she doing?" Brittany whimpered. "She's got a needle." "Stop her," Thorne yelled, trying to stand up but slipping on the bloody floor. "Knox! Sergeant, she's trying to stab him. She's having a psychotic break." Sergeant Major Knox took a step forward. He had watched the fight with narrow, calculating eyes. He had seen the way she dismantled the guards. That wasn't psychosis. That was training. He saw the way she held the needle, not like a weapon, but like a tool. Knox held up a hand, stopping his own men from interfering. "Hold," he grunted. Evelyn didn't see Knox. She didn't see Thorne. Her world had narrowed down to a 3-inch square on the colonel's chest. She placed her left hand on Vance's sternum. Her fingers walked down the bone, finding the xiphoid process, the little cartilage tip at the bottom of the breastbone. She moved slightly to the left, finding the angle. The monitors were screaming a solid, continuous tone now. V-fib. His heart was quivering. It was giving up. "No, you don't," Evelyn hissed. "Not on my watch, Iron." She didn't hesitate. She didn't look for an antiseptic wipe. There was no time for sterile fields. She positioned the needle at a 45-degree angle to the skin, aiming toward the left shoulder. "No!" Thorne screamed, lunging forward again. Evelyn drove the needle in. It punched through the skin. It grated past the cartilage of the ribs. She felt the resistance of the muscle, and then the distinct popping sensation of piercing the pericardium. She pulled the stylet back. Dark, non-clotted blood shot into the barrel of the syringe attached to the needle. "Got you," she whispered. The room held its breath. Evelyn held the catheter steady with hands that were rock solid, defying the tremors that plagued her during paperwork. She watched the monitor. The flatline tone persisted for 1 second, 2 seconds, then a spike. Beep. Chaos turned into a vacuum of silence. Beep. Stronger this time. Beep, beep, beep. The jagged, chaotic line on the monitor smoothed out into a sinus rhythm. It was fast, tachycardic, but it was organized. It was a heartbeat. The colonel's chest heaved. A ragged, desperate gasp of air rushed into his lungs, no longer fighting against the crushing pressure of his own heart. The distended veins in his neck began to flatten, draining as the pump started working again. Evelyn didn't let go of the needle. She stayed hunched over him, acting as a human anchor, her eyes glued to the numbers climbing on the screen. Oxygen saturation, 85%, 88%, 92%. Blood pressure, 90, 60. "He's back," Dr. Silva whispered, his hand falling away from the lethal syringe. He looked at Evelyn with a mixture of terror and reverence. "How did you—" Evelyn slowly straightened up, though she kept one hand stabilizing the catheter. She turned her head slowly to look at Thorne. The chief resident was pulling himself up by the edge of the counter. His tie was crooked, his hair messed, and his ego shattered on the floor, along with the surgical instruments. He stared at the monitor, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He looked at the needle sticking out of the colonel's chest, the procedure he had been too panicked to even consider. "You," Thorne stammered, pointing a shaking finger at her. "You assaulted me. You performed an invasive surgical procedure without a license. You—" "I saved his life," Evelyn said. Her voice was flat, devoid of triumph. It was just a statement of fact. "You were treating the hole in his gut while his heart was being crushed in a vice. You were about to kill him, doctor." Thorne's face turned a violent shade of purple. The humiliation was total. His residents were watching. The nurses were watching. The Delta Force operators were watching. "Get out!" Thorne hissed. "Get out of my hospital. You are done. I will have your license revoked. I will have you arrested for battery. Get out!" Evelyn looked down at her hands. They were covered in the colonel's blood. She looked at the monitor one last time to ensure the rhythm was holding. "Stabilize that catheter with tape," Evelyn ordered Silva, ignoring Thorne completely. "Start the O-negative. He still needs the OR for the abdomen, but now he'll live long enough to get there." She stepped back, her hands raised slightly to show she was disengaging. Sergeant Major Knox stepped into her path. For a second, Evelyn thought he was going to detain her. She tensed, ready to fight again if she had to. But Knox didn't grab her. He looked at the unconscious colonel, then he looked at the needle, and finally he looked at Evelyn. His eyes lingered on the way she stood, feet shoulder-width apart, weight balanced. He looked at the name tag that was hanging crookedly on her scrub top. E. Wright, RN. "Who are you?" Knox asked, his voice a low rumble. "Just a nurse," Evelyn said softly. "Just a tired old nurse." She limped past him. The adrenaline was starting to fade, and the pain in her knee was coming back with a vengeance, screaming in harmony with the pounding rain against the windows. "Security!" Thorne was shouting into the hallway now. "I want police! I want charges pressed!" Evelyn walked toward the exit of the trauma bay. She didn't run. She walked with the dignity of someone who had done her duty, even if it cost her everything. She knew what was coming next: the firing squad, the end of the insurance, the end of the treatments. But as she passed the threshold, she heard the steady beep, beep, beep of the monitor. It was the only payment she was going to get, and for a brief fleeting moment, it was enough. The sound was small, a sharp hiss of escaping air that cut through the cacophony of the trauma bay like a razor wire. It was followed immediately by the dark, sinister flow of maroon fluid filling the barrel of the syringe in Evelyn's hand. To the uninitiated, it looked like death. To Evelyn Wright, it was the most beautiful sight in the world. It was the physical manifestation of pressure releasing, the hydraulic vice grip on Colonel Vance's heart finally letting go. "Keep coming," Evelyn whispered, her eyes locked on the fluid. "Give me room." She held the catheter with a steadiness that defied her age, and the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Beside her, the cardiac monitor, which had been screaming a high-pitched, continuous warning of imminent flatline, stuttered. Beep! The sound was weak, irregular, but it was there. Beep! Beep! Then, as the pericardial sac drained, allowing the heart muscle to expand and fill with blood once more, the rhythm found its footing. The chaotic squiggles on the screen smoothed out into tall, rhythmic spikes. Beep! 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 "Sinus tachycardia," Dr. Silva breathed, staring at the screen as if witnessing a resurrection. "Rate is 110. Blood pressure, my God, blood pressure is rebounding. 90 over 60, 95 over 65. On the table, the effect was instantaneous. Colonel Samuel Iron Vance, a man who had been gray and lifeless seconds ago, suddenly arched his back. His chest heaved, pulling in a massive, ragged draft of air that sounded like a drowning man breaking the surface of the ocean. The distended veins in his neck, which had been roped tight like garden hoses, collapsed as the blood finally flowed downstream. The flush of life, faint but undeniable, began to creep back into his cheeks, replacing the waxy pallor of death. Evelyn didn't move. She couldn't. She was the anchor. Until that catheter was secured, she was the only thing keeping the fluid from reaccumulating. "Tape," Evelyn ordered. She didn't look up. She didn't ask nicely. "Someone secure this line. Now." Brittany, the young nurse who had been paralyzed by fear moments before, snapped out of her trance. She rushed forward with a roll of medical tape, her hands trembling as she tore off strips. She carefully secured the plastic hub of the needle to the colonel's chest, following Evelyn's silent guidance. "He's with us," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a soothing register, though her eyes remained vigilant. "You're back, soldier. Easy now." Beneath her hand, Colonel Vance was shifting. The anesthesia Dr. Silva had pushed, though not enough to kill him thanks to Evelyn's intervention, combined with the massive trauma, meant he was floating in a dark, confused limbo. But the pain was real, and the voice. The voice was familiar. Inside Vance's mind, the harsh fluorescent lights of Chicago Memorial dissolved. The smell of antiseptic and rain vanished, replaced by the choking dust of the Argandab River Valley. The ceiling wasn't acoustic tile. It was the canvas roof of a field hospital, flapping in a hot wind. He was back in Kandahar. He was 28 again, bleeding out from an IED blast that had taken his lieutenant. He remembered the heat. He remembered the fading light. And he remembered the woman who had refused to let him go. "Stay with me, Iron. You don't get to quit today." Vance blinked, his eyelids fluttering. The fog in his brain parted just enough to reveal a face hovering above him. It was older. There were lines around the eyes that hadn't been there before. The hair was gray, not the dusty brown he remembered, but the eyes. The steel-gray eyes were the same. He tried to speak, but his throat felt like it was filled with broken glass. He tried to salute, to acknowledge the ranking officer of his soul, but his arms felt like lead. With a monumental effort, he lifted his right hand. It was shaking violently, smeared with his own drying blood. Evelyn saw the movement. She didn't pull away. She shifted her weight, allowing him to reach her. Vance's hand didn't find her fingers. His grip, weak and desperate, closed around her right wrist. His thumb pressed into the soft skin on the underside of her arm, feeling the ridge of scar tissue there. It was a faint star-shaped burn scar, a souvenir from a hot shell casing that had ejected from a jam and seared into her skin while she was dragging a wounded ranger to cover. It was a mark only a few people knew existed. The tactile sensation grounded him. It confirmed what his eyes couldn't quite believe. Falcon, the whisper was barely a breath. It was a ghost of a word, choked out through blood and exhaustion. Evelyn froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Falcon, Chim-ung, her old call sign, the name she had buried under a decade of silence and civilian scrubs. She looked down at him, her stoic mask cracking for the first time. Her eyes welled with sudden hot tears. She leaned in close, so only he could hear. "I'm here, Sam," she whispered using his first name, a breach of protocol that spanned 15 years. "I've got you. Stand down." Vance's eyes lost their focus as the exhaustion claimed him. His grip on her wrist slackened, his hand sliding off her arm to rest on the sheet. But the corner of his mouth twitched, a micro-expression of absolute relief. He was safe. The Falcon was on watch. "He's out," Evelyn said, straightening up. She wiped her eyes quickly with her shoulder, turning back to the monitor. "Vitals are stable. He's ready for transport to the OR for the abdominal repair." The silence in the room was absolute. The Delta Force operators were staring at her. Sergeant Major Knox was looking at her wrist, where the bloody handprint of his commander was still visible. He had heard the whisper. He knew what Falcon meant in the lore of the unit. But the silence was shattered by a sound from the floor. "You—" Dr. Marcus Thorne clawed his way up, using the side of a crash cart. He looked like a ruin of a man. His immaculate white coat was stained with dirt from the floor and smears of blood from the tray he had crashed into. His hair was disheveled, and his expensive glasses were crooked, but it was his face that was truly ugly. It was twisted into a rictus of pure, unadulterated humiliation. He had been wrong, catastrophically, publicly, and dangerously wrong, and the person who had proven it wasn't a peer or a superior. It was the invisible woman, the nurse he had mocked, the antique he had bet against. His ego couldn't process the reality of his failure, so it converted the shame into rage. "You psychotic bitch!" Thorne screamed, his voice cracking. The violence of his tone made Brittany flinch. Even Dr. Silva took a step back. Thorne stumbled forward, pointing a shaking finger at Evelyn. "You assaulted a physician. You performed an unauthorized invasive procedure on a VIP patient. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Evelyn turned to face him. She didn't cower. She didn't look at the floor. She stood with her feet shoulder-width apart, her hands at her sides, calm amidst the storm. "I saved his life, Doctor," Evelyn said coolly. "Something you were too busy panicking to do." "You got lucky," Thorne shrieked, spit flying from his lips. "You gambled with his life. That was reckless endangerment. You could have punctured his heart." "But I didn't," Evelyn replied, "because I know my anatomy, and I know when a doctor is drowning." Thorne's face turned a violent shade of crimson. He looked around the room, desperate for an ally, but finding only the cold, judging stares of the soldiers and the confused looks of his residents. He needed to regain control. He needed to crush her. "Get out," Thorne hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper before rising to a shout. "You are fired. Do you hear me right? You are done. I want you off this property immediately." He turned to the security guard, Miller, who was just getting to his feet, nursing his wrist. "Escort her out," Thorne commanded, "and call the police. I want to press charges for assault and battery. I want her license stripped, and I want her in a cell tonight." Evelyn looked at Thorne. She saw the fear behind his eyes, the terror of a small man who had been exposed. She could fight him. She could appeal to the soldiers standing there. She could explain about the tension, pneumothorax, and the cardiac tamponade to the medical board. But then she thought of Arthur. She thought of the cancer treatments. She thought of the health insurance that was tied to this job. If she caused a scene now, if she got arrested, the hospital legal team would crush her. They would bury her under litigation before she could ever prove she was right. She had won the battle for Vance's life, but she had lost the war for her own survival. Evelyn exhaled slowly. The fight drained out of her posture. The soldier receded, and the tired middle-aged woman returned. "There's no need for security," Evelyn said softly. Her voice trembled, just a little. "I know the way out." She turned to Dr. Silva. Watch his potassium levels during surgery. Massive transfusions can cause electrolyte imbalances. Don't let him arrhythmia on the table." Silva nodded dumbly. "Yes. Yes, ma'am." Evelyn looked at Colonel Vance one last time. He was breathing. He was alive. She turned and began the long walk to the door. Her knee screamed with every step. Her shoes squeaked on the linoleum. She walked past Sergeant Major Knox, who didn't move out of her way, but turned his body to track her, his eyes unreadable behind his tactical glasses. "You're making a mistake, Doctor," Knox rumbled, his voice low. "Stay out of this, Sergeant," Thorne snapped, adjusting his crooked tie with trembling hands. "This is a hospital matter. This woman is a liability." Evelyn pushed through the double doors, the sounds of the trauma bay, the beeping monitors, the shouting orders. The life she had just saved faded behind her. She was back in the hallway. The rain was still hammering against the windows, harder than before. She was alone. She was fired. And as she walked toward the locker room to collect her cardboard box, the only thing she felt was the phantom warmth of a soldier's blood on her wrist, right over the scar that marked her as one of them. The locker room was quiet, save for the hum of the vending machine and the hollow metallic clang of Locker 402 slamming shut for the last time. Evelyn Wright stood before the gray metal door, her reflection distorted in the brushed steel. She looked smaller than she felt. In her arms, she held a cardboard box that had once held sterile saline solution. Now, it held the sum total of her 3 years at Chicago Memorial Hospital. A cracked coffee mug with a picture of a cat on it, a gift from a patient who had passed away last winter. A spare sweater, a cheap stethoscope she had bought with her own money because the hospital-issued ones hurt her ears, and a small framed photograph of Arthur. In the photo, Arthur was smiling, his face fuller, his hair still thick and dark. It was taken before the diagnosis, before the chemo started eating him away from the inside out. "Badge," the security guard grunted. It was Miller, the guard whose wrist she had nearly snapped 20 minutes ago. He was holding his arm against his chest, nursing a makeshift ice pack. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked wary, keeping a safe distance as if Evelyn might explode if he moved too fast. Evelyn set the box down on the bench. Her hands were shaking, not from adrenaline now, but from the crashing low that follows it. She unclipped the plastic ID card from her scrub top. It felt heavy, like an anchor. Evelyn Wright, RN. Access level, all areas. She handed it to Miller. He snatched it away quickly as if it burned him. "You're barred from the premises, Ms. Wright," Miller recited, his voice lacking conviction. "If you return, you will be trespassing." "I know the drill, Miller," Evelyn said softly. "Take care of that wrist. Ice for 20 minutes, off for 20. Don't let it swell." Miller blinked, confused by the medical advice coming from the woman he was evicting. He didn't say thank you. He just pointed toward the service exit. Evelyn picked up her box. The weight of it settled into her shoulders. She walked down the long, linoleum corridor, the squeak of her wet sneakers echoing off the walls. She didn't look back at the trauma bay. She didn't look back at the patients lining the hallways. She walked past the "Heroes Work Here" banner hanging near the exit, a bitter taste rising in her throat. She pushed the heavy door open and stepped out into the night. Chicago didn't offer any sympathy. The storm that had been raging against the windows was now a physical assault. The wind coming off Lake Michigan hit her like a physical blow, driving sheets of freezing rain horizontal. It soaked through her thin scrubs in seconds, plastering the fabric to her skin. Evelyn gasped, hugging the box to her chest to protect Arthur's photo. She limped toward the bus stop shelter about 50 yards away. Every step sent a jolt of agony through her right knee, the damp cold seeping into the titanium pins and the scarred nerves. It felt like the shrapnel was twisting inside her leg all over again. She reached the shelter, a plexiglass box that smelled of wet wool and stale cigarette smoke, and collapsed onto the metal bench. It offered little protection. The wind whipped the rain inside, swirling around her ankles. She checked her watch. 02:15 a.m., the graveyard shift. "Arthur," she whispered to the box, "I'm so sorry." Inside the hospital, on the 4th floor, the atmosphere was very different. Dr. Marcus Thorne stood in the private bathroom of the chief resident's office. He was scrubbing his hands, the water running scalding hot. He scrubbed until his skin was raw and red. trying to wash away the sensation of being shoved into a tray of surgical instruments. He looked at himself in the mirror. His hair was recombed, his bloodied white coat replaced with a fresh one he kept for press conferences. He adjusted his silk tie, practicing his expression: concern, gravitas, authority. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed a number he had memorized. "Director Henderson?" Thorne said, his voice dropping into a smooth, professional baritone. "I apologize for waking you, sir. We had a situation." He listened for a moment, pacing the small room. "Yes, it was the Delta Force extraction. It was chaotic, sir. We had a rogue element. Nurse Wright?" Thorne paused, letting the silence do the work. "She snapped. Acute psychotic break, I believe. Perhaps early-onset dementia aggravated by the stress." Thorne stopped pacing and looked out the window at the rain-lashed city below. "She attacked security, sir. She tried to stab the patient with a non-sterile needle. I had to intervene physically to stop her." He listened to the director's shocked gasp on the other end of the line. "Yes, it was terrifying. But don't worry, sir. I managed to stabilize the colonel. I performed a pericardiocentesis under extremely difficult conditions after securing the scene. The patient is stable and en route to the OR now. I handled it." A smile curled the corner of Thorne's lip. It was a reptile smile. "Yes, I fired her immediately. She's gone. We'll need to prepare a statement for the legal team in case she tries to sue, but frankly, sir, with her history of erratic behavior, no one will believe her. I saved the hospital from a massive lawsuit tonight." He hung up the phone. He checked his reflection one last time. The lie was perfect. It was seamless. He wasn't the villain who missed a diagnosis. He was the hero who saved a VIP from a crazy woman. Thorne walked out of the office and headed toward the elevator. He needed to be seen. He needed to check on his patient. Back on the street, the cold had worked its way into Evelyn's marrow. Her teeth were chattering, a rhythmic clicking sound she couldn't control. She stared down the empty street, looking for the headlights of the number 66 bus. It was the last one for an hour. If she missed it, she would have to walk 3 miles in this storm, or pay for a cab she couldn't afford. The automatic doors of the hospital entrance slid open behind her. Evelyn didn't turn. She assumed it was security making sure she wasn't loitering. "Hey, wait up!" The voice was gravelly and breathless. Evelyn turned her head. Running toward her through the downpour was Gus. The old janitor was moving faster than she had ever seen him move. His custodial jumpsuit soaked instantly. He was struggling with a large black umbrella that had seen better days. One of the spokes was broken, flapping uselessly in the wind. He reached the shelter and collapsed against the plexiglass, wheezing. "Gus!" Evelyn stood up, alarm cutting through her misery. "What are you doing? You'll catch pneumonia out here." You walk too fast for a woman with a bad knee," Gus gasped, clutching his chest. He straightened up and thrust the umbrella toward her. "Here, take it." "I can't take your umbrella, Gus," Evelyn said, shaking her head. "You have to walk to the train." "Take the damn thing, Dusty," Gus ordered, using the nickname he had silently bestowed upon her in the stairwell. "I got a raincoat in my locker. You got nothing but scrubs and a cardboard box." He forced the handle into her cold hand. His fingers were warm, rough like sandpaper. "I saw what you did," Gus said, his voice dropping low to cut under the wind. "I was mopping the hallway outside Trauma 1. I saw through the window." Evelyn looked down. "I caused a scene, Gus. I got fired." "You saved that boy," Gus said fiercely. He pointed a gnarled finger at the hospital. "That pretty boy doctor? He was running around like a headless chicken. You moved like you were back in the sandbox. You stuck that needle in and brought him back." Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat. "Thorne says I assaulted him. He says I'm crazy." "Thorne is a coward," Gus spat. "And cowards always lie to cover their shame. But I know what I saw. And those soldiers, the big one with the beard, he saw it too." "It doesn't matter," Evelyn whispered. "I lost the insurance, Gus. Arthur, I don't know what I'm going to tell Arthur." "You tell him you did your duty," Gus said. He reached out and squeezed her shoulder. "The world is full of people who turn away, Evelyn. You didn't turn away. That counts for something, even if the suits don't see it." A roar of an engine cut through their conversation. A spray of water washed over the curb. Evelyn spun around just in time to see the red taillights of the city bus fading into the mist. It had passed right by while they were talking, the driver likely not seeing them through the rain and the distraction. No, Evelyn gasped, stepping out from the shelter. No, wait! She waved her hand, but it was useless. The bus was gone. Damn it! Evelyn swore, her shoulders slumping. That was the last one. Ah, hell. Gus rubbed the back of his neck, looking guilty. That's my fault. I kept you talking. It's okay, Gus, Evelyn sighed, though she felt like crying. I'll wait for the next one. Or I'll walk. You aren't walking on that knee, Gus said firmly. Sit down. I'll stay with you until the next one comes. I got a flask of whiskey in my locker if you want me to run back and get it. Evelyn managed a weak, watery smile. Just sit with me, Gus. That's enough. They sat together on the metal bench, huddled under the broken umbrella. Inside the hospital, Thorne was spinning his web of lies, cementing his victory. Outside, Evelyn was shivering, defeated and unemployed. But she wasn't alone, and because she had missed the bus, she was still there sitting on that bench when the low, thumping vibration began to shake the puddles on the street. It wasn't thunder, it was a convoy. Far down the avenue, piercing the gloom like the eyes of angry dragons, a line of HID headlights appeared. Black SUVs, military Humvees. They were moving fast, cutting through red lights, pushing the city traffic aside. Evelyn watched them approach, hugging her box. She didn't know it yet, but the rain wasn't just washing away her career. It was preparing the ground for something else entirely. The intensive care unit on the 4th floor was a sanctuary of hushed tones and rhythmic mechanical breathing. It was a stark contrast to the blood-soaked chaos of the trauma bay below. Here, life was measured in digital readouts and the slow drip of saline. Colonel Samuel Iron Vance floated back to consciousness through layers of heavy sedation. His first sensation was pain, a deep, dull throb in his abdomen that felt like he had been kicked by a mule, and a sharper, stinging ache in his chest. He blinked, his eyelids feeling like sandpaper. The ceiling tiles came into focus. White, sterile, safe. He's coming around, a soft voice said. Vance turned his head, the movement sending a spike of agony through his neck muscles. Standing at the foot of his bed was Dr. Marcus Thorne. The chief resident had cleaned up. He was wearing a fresh, starch-stiff white coat that gleamed under the recessed lighting. His hair was perfectly combed, and he wore a stethoscope draped casually around his neck like a badge of office. He held a chart in his hands, looking every inch the benevolent healer. Standing near the door, rigid as a statue, was Sergeant Major Knox. The big NCO hadn't washed. He was still in his mud-caked combat gear, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes hidden behind dark ballistic glasses despite being indoors. He wasn't looking at the doctor, he was watching the hallway. Colonel Vance, Thorne said, stepping forward with a practiced, oily smile. Welcome back to the land of the living. You gave us quite a scare down there. Vance tried to speak, but his mouth was dry as desert sand. He licked his cracked lips. Water. Thorne nodded to a nurse, who quickly brought a cup with a straw. Vance took a small sip, the cool liquid soothing the fire in his throat. Status, Vance croaked. The word was a reflex. Command didn't stop for injury. You're stable, Colonel, Thorne said, leaning against the bed rail with an air of casual ownership. You suffered a massive abdominal evisceration and significant blood loss. It was touch and go. But we managed to get you into surgery and repair the intestinal damage. You're going to have a hell of a scar, but you'll live. Vance's brow furrowed. The memories were fragmented. He remembered the ambush, the chopper ride, the feeling of drowning, and then the pressure, the crushing weight on his chest that had nothing to do with his stomach. My chest, Vance rasped, his hand moving weakly toward the bandage on his sternum. Thorne didn't blink. Yes, a complication. Cardiac tamponade, fluid around the heart. I had to perform an emergency pericardiocentesis right there in the bay. It was a split-second decision, but I managed to drain it before you arrested. Vance stared at the doctor. The fog in his brain was lifting, burned away by the heat of suspicion. He remembered a face. It wasn't Thorne's. He remembered a voice. It wasn't smooth and arrogant. It was raspy and kind. And he remembered a touch. The woman, Vance whispered. Thorne's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered. Woman? Oh, You mean the nurse. Thorne let out a short, dismissive laugh. I apologize for that, Colonel. We had a personnel issue. An older nurse. She suffered a psychotic break during your intake. She was interfering with my procedure, shouting nonsense. It was quite traumatic. Vance's eyes, usually the color of warm hazel, darkened into flat, hard steel. Interfering? She was hysterical, Thorne continued, waving his hand as if swatting away a fly. She tried to attack me. I had security remove her. Don't worry, Colonel. I fired her immediately. She's been escorted off the premises. She won't be bothering anyone ever again. The word fired hung in the air like a gunshot. Vance lay very still. His heart rate monitor began to tick up. Beep, beep, beep. He looked at Thorne. He really looked at him. He saw the soft hands. He saw the pristine coat. And then he looked at Knox. The sergeant major gave a barely perceptible shake of his head. Doctor, Vance said. His voice was no longer a croak. It was a low rumble, the sound of a tank engine idling. Yes, Colonel? This nurse you fired, Vance said slowly, enunciating every syllable. The one who was hysterical. Did you notice her right wrist? Thorne blinked, confused by the specificity of the question. Her wrist? I'm not sure I follow. Her right wrist, Vance repeated, his intensity rising. On the underside, just below the palm. Did you see the scar? Thorne laughed nervously. Colonel, I was a little busy saving your life. I didn't have time to inspect the dermatological history of a crazy janitor nurse. It's a burn scar, Vance said, his eyes never leaving Thorne's face. Star-shaped, from a hot shell casing ejected from an M4 carbine. It happened in the Argandab Valley 15 years ago. She got it while she was dragging a wounded ranger, me, out of a kill zone. Thorne's smile evaporated. He took a step back from the bed. I don't know what you're talking about. You're hallucinating from the anesthesia. I'm not hallucinating, Vance growled. He tried to sit up. The pain in his abdomen screamed, tearing at his stitches, but he ignored it. I felt it. When she put the needle in my chest, when she saved me. Lay back, Thorne snapped, his composure cracking. You are reopening your wounds. Sergeant, restrain him. Sergeant Major Knox pushed himself off the wall. He walked toward the bed, but he didn't reach for the colonel. He walked past Thorne, bumping the doctor's shoulder hard enough to spin him around, and stood at attention next to Vance's head. Sir, Knox said, his voice crisp. I confirm visual contact with the subject in the trauma bay. Female, Caucasian, mid-50s, responded to the call sign Falcon. Vance looked at Knox. You knew? I suspected, sir, Knox said. But this civilian, he gestured to Thorne with a thumb like a sausage, threatened to have her arrested. She left to protect her pension. I didn't have authorization to detain a civilian non-combatant until you woke up. Vance turned back to Thorne. The predator was fully awake now. You fired her? Vance whispered. The quietness of his tone was far more terrifying than a shout. You fired the ghost medic, and you tried to steal her valor. This is ridiculous, Thorne sputtered, backing toward the door. I am the chief resident. My father is a senator. You can't speak to me like this. That woman is a nobody. Vance didn't answer. He reached up and grabbed the IV lines, taping him to the machinery. Colonel, don't! The nurse in the corner gasped. Vance ripped them out. Blood sprayed from the access port, splattering the pristine white sheets. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, groaning as his abdominal muscles protested the movement. He was pale, he was sweating, and he was bleeding, but he was standing. Knox, Vance commanded, leaning heavily on the bedside table. Phone. Knox handed him a ruggedized satellite phone from his vest pouch. Who are you calling? Thorne demanded, his voice shrill. I'm calling security. Call them, Vance spat. You're going to need them. Vance dialed a number. He didn't look at the keypad. He held the phone to his ear, his eyes locked on Thorne. General, Vance said into the phone. It's Iron. We found her. Yes, sir. Chicago Memorial. No, sir, it's hostile. The administration is hostile. They neutralized the asset. Yes, sir. I'm initiating a hard lock. Vance lowered the phone. He looked at Knox. Get the boys, Vance ordered. Secure the lobby. Nobody leaves, nobody enters. If this doctor tries to leave the floor, zip tie him. Hoo-ah, Knox grinned. a terrifying wolfish expression. He tapped his earpiece. "All stations, this is Knox. Package is awake. We are green on the asset. Initiate containment protocol. Go, go, go." Thorne stood frozen, his mouth agape. "You can't do this. This is a hospital." "Not anymore," Vance said, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "Now, it's a retrieval operation." Outside, the storm was reaching its crescendo. The rain slashed sideways, turning the world into a blur of gray and black. Evelyn sat on the bench at the bus stop, shivering under Gus's broken umbrella, completely unaware that the building behind her had just become a fortress. But the ground knew. It started as a vibration in the soles of her wet sneakers, a low, rhythmic thrumming that was deeper than the thunder. The puddles on the asphalt began to ripple in concentric circles. Gus looked up from his flask. "You hear that?" Evelyn squinted into the dark rain. "Thunder?" "No," Gus said, his old eyes widening. "That ain't thunder, that's diesel." Then, the darkness at the end of the street split open. They didn't come with sirens. They came with raw power. A convoy of 4 matte black, up-armored Humvees roared around the corner, their high-intensity LED light bars slicing through the rain like lightsabers. They were moving in an assault column, taking up both lanes of the street, forcing a taxi to swerve onto the sidewalk. The lead vehicle didn't slow down as it approached the hospital entrance. It jumped the curb, its massive tires crushing the manicured flower bed, and screeched to a halt directly in front of the revolving glass doors. Screech! The doors of the Humvees flew open in perfect unison. 12 operators from the Delta Force support detail poured out. They weren't wearing dress uniforms. They were in full tactical rattle. Helmets, plate carriers, drop-leg holsters. "Secure the perimeter!" a squad leader shouted, his voice amplified by the sudden silence of the street as traffic halted in awe. 2 soldiers took up positions by the revolving doors, their carbines at the low ready. 2 more moved to the ambulance bay. Inside the lobby, the sleepy receptionists and the few waiting patients jumped to their feet. Mr. Henderson, the hospital administrator, who had just come downstairs to grab a coffee after Thorne's phone call, dropped his cup. It shattered, spilling brown liquid across the polished marble. "What is the meaning of this?" Henderson stammered, stepping forward, his face pale. "You can't bring weapons in here." The lead soldier ignored him completely. He scanned the room, his head moving on a swivel, checking corners, checking exits. The sheer, overwhelming projection of force turned the large, airy lobby into a cage. The hospital had been seized, not by terrorists, but by the righteous fury of the United States Army, and they were looking for one thing, or rather, one person. The lead Humvee didn't just park. It occupied the space with the heavy, brooding authority of a tank. The rain sizzled against its hot engine hood, sending up clouds of steam that mingled with the exhaust. Evelyn Wright sat frozen on the metal bench, clutching Gus's broken umbrella like a shield. She watched as a soldier in full tactical gear stepped out of the passenger side. He didn't run for cover. He opened the rear door and stood at rigid attention, ignoring the freezing downpour soaking his uniform. A cane emerged first. It was black, polished wood, with a silver handle shaped like a bird of prey. Then came the boot, polished to a mirror shine despite the weather. General Thomas Mitchell stepped onto the wet pavement. He was a man carved from oak and old leather, with a face that looked like a topographical map of every conflict the United States had fought in the last 40 years. He wore a dress uniform under a trench coat, the stars on his shoulders catching the reflection of the streetlights. He was in his late 60s, but he moved with a dangerous, prowling energy. He walked past the armed escort. He walked past the stunned taxi driver who had pulled over. He walked straight to the plexiglass bus shelter. Gus, still holding his flask, slowly stood up. He straightened his spine, the slump of the janitor vanishing to reveal the posture of an old infantryman. He nudged Evelyn. "Reckon they ain't here for the number 66, Dusty," Gus whispered. Evelyn slowly rose to her feet. Her knee screamed, but she didn't feel it. She looked at the general, and the years melted away. She wasn't a fired nurse in wet scrubs. She was back in the sandbox, the smell of burning oil in the air. "General," Evelyn said, her voice cracking slightly. Mitchell stopped 3 feet away. He looked at her wet scrubs, the cardboard box on the bench, and the cheap sneakers. His eyes, usually cold and assessing, softened with a profound, aching respect. "It's been a long time, Evelyn," Mitchell said. His voice was gravel and smoke. 15 years, sir," she replied. Mitchell looked at the box. "Is that it? Is that what they gave you for saving a Delta Force commander?" "They gave me a termination notice, sir," Evelyn said, lifting her chin, "and a threat of arrest." "We're going to fix that," Mitchell said. He didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he snapped his heels together and rendered a slow, crisp salute. "Lieutenant Colonel Wright, your unit is waiting." Gus let out a low whistle. "Lieutenant Colonel," he muttered, shaking his head with a grin that split his weathered face. "I knew you were heavy metal, Dusty, but damn." Evelyn returned the salute, her hand trembling slightly before snapping to her brow. "Ready for duty, sir." "Grab your gear, Colonel," Mitchell said, nodding to the cardboard box. "We're going back inside." He turned to Gus. "You too, trooper. You held the line when nobody else would." Gus looked at his mop bucket near the door, then at the general. He grabbed the broken umbrella and fell in step behind Evelyn. Hoo-ah! The procession that entered the lobby of Chicago Memorial was unlike anything the hospital had ever seen. The automatic doors slid open, and the wind blew in, but nobody noticed the cold. They were too busy watching the phalanx of Delta Force operators parting like the Red Sea. Mr. Henderson, the hospital administrator, was standing near the reception desk, looking like he was about to faint. Beside him, Dr. Marcus Thorne was frantically typing on his phone, likely trying to call his father, the senator. When Thorne saw Evelyn walking in beside a 4-star general, his phone slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the marble floor. "General!" Henderson squeaked, stepping forward with a trembling hand extended. "There must be some misunderstanding. We were just—" "Silence," Mitchell said. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. The word hit Henderson like a physical slap. The general stopped in the center of the lobby. He pointed his cane at the massive flat-screen monitor on the wall, which usually displayed donor names and hospital wait times. "Sergeant Major!" Mitchell barked. "The feed." "Yes, sir," Knox's voice came over the radio. The screen flickered. The generic hospital logo vanished, replaced by grainy, high-contrast footage from the security camera inside Trauma Bay 1. A collective gasp went through the lobby. Nurses, doctors, patients, and staff gathered around, their eyes glued to the screen. The video showed the chaos of the last hour. It showed Thorne panicked, screaming, trying to shove gauze into an abdominal wound. It showed him grabbing the laryngoscope. And then it showed Evelyn. On the massive screen, everyone watched the slow old nurse move with the lethal speed of a viper. They saw her check Thorne. They saw her identify the distended veins. They saw the precise, unwavering strike of the needle into the chest. "Freeze frame," Mitchell ordered. The video paused. The image showed Evelyn's hand on the needle and Thorne on the floor, cowering near the instrument tray. Mitchell turned to Thorne. The general loomed over the doctor, a giant of judgment. "You told the administrator you performed the procedure," Mitchell said, his voice echoing in the silent lobby. "You told them she was psychotic. You told them you saved my commander." Thorne opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at the screen, undeniable proof of his cowardice and incompetence magnified for the world to see. "That," Thorne stammered, sweat pouring down his face, "that is edited. That's a deep fake." "That is a time-stamped federal record now, son," Mitchell growled. "You didn't just lie. You falsified medical records during a military operation. You committed fraud, and you jeopardized the life of a high-value asset." Henderson stepped away from Thorne, putting distance between himself and the radioactive fallout. "Dr. Thorne," Henderson said, his voice shaking, "you are relieved of duty, effective immediately." "You can't do this," Thorne shrieked, the facade crumbling completely. "I'm a Thorne. My family built this wing." "Your family can visit you in federal prison," Mitchell said coldly. He gestured to 2 MPs standing by the door. "Get him out of my sight." As the MPs dragged a screaming Thorne toward the exit, his heels skidding on the polished floor, mirroring the way he had tried to throw Evelyn out, a hush fell over the room. But the silence was broken by a mechanical whirring sound. Ding! The elevator doors opened. A wheelchair rolled out, pushed by a nervous Dr. Silva. But the man in the chair wasn't sitting back. He was gripping the armrests with white-knuckled intensity. Colonel Samuel Iron Vance was pale. He was covered in bandages. He had tubes running into his arm and a drain coming from his abdomen. But he was wearing his beret. "Stop!" Vance commanded. Silva stopped the chair in the middle of the lobby, 20 feet from where Evelyn stood. Vance looked at Evelyn. His eyes were clear now, burning with the intensity that had earned him his call sign. He looked at the woman in the oversized scrubs and the wet sneakers, and he saw the warrior who had pulled him from the fire not once, but twice. "Help me up," Vance grunted to Silva. "Colonel, you can't," Silva whispered. "Your abdominal muscles were severed. You'll rip the stitches." "I said," Vance grit his teeth, sweat popping out on his forehead. "Help. Me. Up." Silva hesitated, then grabbed Vance's arm. A ripple of awe went through the crowd. Every nurse, every doctor watched as the man who had been eviscerated less than 2 hours ago forced his body to obey his will. Vance groaned, a low, guttural sound of agony, as he pushed himself upright. His legs shook violently. He swayed, clutching the IV pole for support. But he stood. He locked eyes with Evelyn. "Attenhut!" Vance bellowed. His voice was raw, but it carried the authority of a thunderclap. The reaction was instantaneous. The 12 Delta Force operators in the lobby snapped their heels together with a sound like a gunshot. General Mitchell straightened his back. Even Gus, standing behind Evelyn with his broken umbrella, snapped to rigid attention, chest out, chin up. They weren't saluting the general. They weren't saluting the flag. Colonel Vance raised his trembling hand. He fought the pain, fought the gravity, and brought his hand to his brow in a perfect, slow salute. "Welcome home, Commander," Vance whispered, though in the silence, everyone heard it. Evelyn felt the tears finally spill over. They mixed with the rain on her cheeks. The shame of the last 3 years, the invisibility, the fear of the bills, the mockery, it all washed away under the weight of that salute. She wasn't the janitor. She wasn't the relic. She was the falcon. She squared her shoulders, ignoring the pain in her knee. She snapped her hand up, returning the salute with the crisp perfection of a career officer. "Good to be back, Iron," she choked out. From the balcony above, a single person started clapping. It was Brittany. Then Dr. Silva joined in. Then the patients. Then Henderson. Within seconds, the lobby of Chicago Memorial erupted into a thunderous ovation that drowned out the storm outside. Epilogue, 6 months later. The rain had turned to snow, dusting the windows of the newly christened Vance Trauma Center at Chicago Memorial. In the corner office on the 4th floor, the office that used to belong to the chief resident, Evelyn Wright sat behind a mahogany desk. The nameplate on the door didn't say nurse. It read, Evelyn Wright, Director of Trauma Training and Medical Ethics. She wasn't wearing scrubs. She was wearing a blazer, though beneath the desk, she still wore her comfortable New Balance sneakers. She picked up a file from her desk. It was the final report on Marcus Thorne. The medical board had stripped his license permanently. The last she heard, he was managing a spray tan salon in Florida, far away from any sharp objects. Evelyn smiled and set the file aside. She looked at the framed photo sitting next to the picture of Arthur, who was now 3 months into remission thanks to the military's premium health insurance plan. The new photo was candid. It was taken in the hospital lobby on that rainy night. It showed 3 people. In the center was Colonel Vance, sitting in his wheelchair, but looking fierce. On his left was Gus, leaning on his mop bucket like it was a scepter, grinning toothlessly. And on his right was Evelyn, wearing wet scrubs and a field jacket someone had draped over her shoulders, her eyes shining with a fire that would never be extinguished again. Evelyn touched the glass of the photo, then stood up. She grabbed her cane, a gift from General Mitchell, and walked to the door. She had a class of arrogance-prone residents to teach, and she wasn't going to be late. This story reminds us that true worth is never found in titles, degrees, or expensive suits. It is found in experience, humility, and the quiet courage to do the right thing, even when no one is watching. We must never judge a book by its cover, and we should never underestimate the person standing quietly in the corner. The hands that look the most tired are often the ones that have carried the heaviest burdens, and the person we overlook today might be the very hero sent to save us tomorrow. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button. It helps us share these important tales of hidden heroes with the world. Please share this video with a friend or family member who needs a reminder that they are valuable, no matter what the world tells them. And if you have not already, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story of hope and justice. Now, let us bow our heads for a short prayer. Dear Lord, we thank you for the hidden angels you place in our path every single day. We ask you to bless the nurses, the caretakers, and the quiet guardians who protect us when we are at our weakest. Give us the eyes to see the worth in every soul we meet, and grant us the courage to stand for truth, even when we have to stand alone. Watch over everyone listening to this message, heal their wounds, and fill their hearts with your peace. In Jesus' name, we pray. If you believe that God sends angels in scrubs to watch over us, please write amen in the comments below.